Now at 9 o'clock, the news with Michael Buerk.
The UN is preparing a mass evacuation from the besieged Bosnian town of Srebrenica. They want to get 15,000 Muslims out before the town falls to the Serbs. The IRA suspect, Nessun Quinlivan, will be tried in Dublin before any attempt to extradite him to Britain. And the Jockey Club has ordered a full-scale inquiry into the Grand National fiasco. Good evening. The UN has decided to attempt a mass evacuation of civilians from the Muslim enclave of Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia. But tonight there have been reports of fighting and heavy shelling to the south of the town, and it's thought it could fall to the surrounding Serbs at any time. The UN's preparing to move up to 15,000 people from Srebrenica to relative safety in Tuzla. They've already brought out 5,000 along that route. The UN's been accused of helping the Serbs carry out their policy of so-called ethnic cleansing, but UN officials say their overriding objective is to save lives.
In trying to do what it thinks is best for the people of Srebrenica, the UN has spent more time planning, waiting around, being turned back and thwarted constantly by both sides, than actually moving refugees out. It believes that the population of the besieged town should be reduced, particularly those who are already refugees, the thousands who have no real accommodation or support in the town. And on this basis, the High Commissioner for Refugees Special Envoy denies being involved with the policy of ethnic cleansing.
The people we are evacuating from Srebrenica have already been ethnically cleansed, because they are coming from areas that have already fallen under Serbian control. They are not people from Srebrenica, they are refugees that arrive
from the villages around.
Villages around, and also from Kanjevice, Polje, from Srpska, areas that fall under Serbian control a couple of weeks ago.
However, Mr. Mendelucci's plan today is ambitious. For over a week, large convoys similar to the 20-truck ones he's now proposing have at times been delayed or refused passage by a single individual military official at a routine checkpoint. The situation is being both intensified and muddled by more fighting. Though the ceasefire is holding up relatively well in most of Bosnia, there is heavy fighting round Srebrenica, with the Serbs shelling south of the town and the Muslims fighting back hard. Also, there is no firm commitment on the ground to the UN's evacuation plans. They are ambitious, and there is considerable doubt here that all will go smoothly. Kate Adey, BBC News, Bosnia.
The EC's peace envoy, Lord Owen, has called for relentless pressure on the Serbs until the UN's peace plan for Bosnia is accepted. And EC foreign ministers, who've been meeting in Luxembourg, have called for the total isolation of Serbia unless it agrees to the plan. Earlier, the Western European Union Defence Alliance agreed to send patrol boats and armed police to the River Danube to reinforce sanctions against Belgrade.
Community foreign ministers flew to Luxembourg to put in place a double strategy against Serbia, by tightening existing sanctions, by calling for new, stronger measures from the United Nations Security Council. The EC wants all freight traffic into Serbia stopped, apart from humanitarian supplies, essential medicines and food. Lord Owen urged ministers to relentless pressure on Belgrade to force Serb acceptance of the peace plan.
If Belgrade decide this is to stop and that they are to agree a peace settlement, then we will have a peace settlement. And that fact must be borne in upon Belgrade. And I think the European community has taken a very strong view on this. We now need relentless pressure. The negotiating has gone on for long enough.
The EC is tightening existing sanctions by sending river police and customs officials to the Danube. 6 countries, including Germany, have volunteered a total force of up to 300, some armed, and 10 boats. They'll help hard-pressed Romanian patrols in stop-and-search operations to prevent supplies, particularly of oil, getting through to Serbia. The Danish EC presidency welcomed this new pressure, but moved quickly to dismiss Washington's call for an end to the UN ban on arms supplies to former Yugoslavia.
I share Lord Owen's concern over such a step. It seems to me obvious that weapons is not what Yugoslavia needs.
The European Community strategy now is to use the collective weight of the 12 member states at the United Nations in New York. The EC will work hard to get tough wording in the new UN Security Council resolution, which it's expected could be adopted later this week. But with pressure from Russia to dilute the impact on Serbia, the EC will work to mobilise international opinion to ensure something close to international isolation for Serbia. James Robbins, BBC News, Luxembourg.
A British Army photographer serving in Bosnia has been wounded. An Army spokesman said Staff Sergeant Peter Bristow was hurt while photographing British soldiers helping refugees to cross the front line between Muslim and Serbian forces near the town of Turbay. A bullet hit his helmet and he suffered injuries to his skull. He's said to be in a stable condition. An IRA suspect, Nessun Quinlivan, has been remanded in custody in the Irish Republic on firearms charges. He's wanted in Britain on charges of conspiracy to murder and to cause explosions. He escaped from Brixton Prison nearly 2 years ago.
Nessun Quinlivan was taken late this afternoon from the police station where he'd been held for a day and a half to be driven to Dublin to face firearms charges. A crowd of supporters had gathered outside Nina Police Station in County Tipperary, and they jeered and shouted as he was taken outside and driven away with a heavily armed escort. It took several hours for the journey to the Republic's anti-terrorist Special Criminal Court, which sits during trials without a jury, where he was charged tonight with unlawful possession of a revolver and 3 bullets and having it and them with intent to endanger life. He'd been arrested yesterday morning and held since then under police and army guard. But around lunchtime today came the decision from the Irish Director of Public Prosecutions that he's to be charged and tried in Ireland, with extradition proceedings delayed till after that.
The likelihood is that extradition proceedings will be deferred until the charges to which I've referred have been disposed of.
Nessun Quinlivan was visited earlier in the day at Nina by his sisters, Emer O'Connor and Cléna Quinlivan, who said that he'll fight extradition if and when proceedings are started.
During his last arrest in Britain and his subsequent escape from Brixton, there was an awful lot of media hype, and there was a lot of things said and printed about him. You know, that a lot of it was basically untrue. You know, the journalists just printed what they thought was the story as opposed to what the story was.
I don't think if he does go to Britain he won't get a fair trial.
Oh, I don't think so.
And none of our family do think that, and we're in full agreement that if he goes to Britain he will not get a fair trial.
This evening he arrived at court in Dublin, where he was charged during a 20-minute hearing, which now ensures that any question of extradition to Britain will not arise until after his trial at the earliest, and if he's convicted, until after he's served his sentence. He and another man escaped from Brixton Prison almost 18 months ago while awaiting trial on terrorist-type charges. When he appeared in court, he was asked, was he Nessun Quinlivan? He gave no reply. A Scotland Yard detective was in court prepared to give evidence on his identity, but prosecution counsel said he didn't propose to call him before the trial. Nessun Quinlivan was remanded in custody until April the 20th. His solicitor said there would be a bail application, but tonight he's back in jail, this time Ireland's maximum security Portlaoise prison. Dennis Murray, BBC News, Dublin.
A former member of the banned loyalist group, the Ulster Defence Association, has been shot dead in Northern Ireland. William Killen, who was 36, was murdered in the fishing village of Portavogie. In 1982, he was convicted of helping to cover up the murder of another UDA member. The killers broke through the front door of Mr. Killen's ground floor flat and shot him several times. They'd hijacked a taxi and locked the driver in the boot. Leaders of the Group of 7 richest industrial nations have welcomed the results of the Vancouver summit meeting between Presidents Clinton and Yeltsin. But Britain and Germany have said Russia will need a lot more help than the $1.6 billion pledged by the United States. The aid package is described as a first instalment, with Mr. Clinton promising further measures later. The Vancouver deal provides loans of $700 million for grain and other food purchases, $230 million in loans for trade and investment. There are direct grants worth $690 million for a range of projects that assist the reform process, including industrial privatisation, joint venture businesses and oil pipeline equipment. From Vancouver, Martin Sixsmith reports.
For a politician who's been accused of prevarication and indecision, Bill Clinton met his first foreign policy challenge with surprising resolution, pledging US support not only for the concept of reform in Russia, but unequivocally for Boris Yeltsin.
Mr. President, our nation will not stand on the sidelines when it comes to democracy and Russia. We actively support reform and reformers and you in Russia.
For his part, Boris Yeltsin reasserted what the White House already believes and fears. If Yeltsin falls, then Russia's reform program falls with him.
Today there is no alternative to Yeltsin. Tomorrow maybe, but today there is none.
More even than the money he was promised at this summit, it was the pledge of full US commitment that delighted Boris Yeltsin, the knowledge that in Russia's power struggle, all Washington's eggs are now in one basket.
Mr. Yeltsin is the freely elected president of the country. He is committed to democracy and free markets. So I think this is a good basket to have our eggs in, and moreover, he is by far the most effective person in that country.
But President Clinton knows that foreign aid is not popular with the taxpayers. He's promised them that the US dollars pledged in Vancouver will be used effectively to promote democracy in Russia. And he's now calling on the international community to follow Washington's lead with a much larger package of assistance. At Vancouver, Bill Clinton burned his bridges with the opposition in Russia. And while there's little argument here that Russian reform is in America's interests, there is some criticism that the president is tying himself too closely to one political leader, and that, like George Bush with Mikhail Gorbachev, he's failed to keep his options open in case his man should fall from power. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Vancouver.
President Yeltsin has already resumed campaigning for a vote of confidence in this month's referendum. In Siberia, he told workers the Vancouver aid package was detailed and substantial, with specific dates and projects for all the money. But his opponents will be trying to use the outcome of the summit against him.
Flush with Mr. Clinton's dollars, Boris Yeltsin immediately seized the initiative in his campaign to save his presidency. On a stopover en route from Vancouver to Moscow, he promised Siberians they would be the recipients of most of the aid package, a slight embellishment of the facts blatantly designed to win him votes in the referendum in 3 weeks' time.
The referendum is the main thing. The fate of Russia depends on it, and on how the people will vote.
While the president went campaigning in a knitwear factory, his opponents said not a word today about the aid deal, but it can only be a matter of time before they start doing it down. There's a ready audience for them in the streets of Moscow. Most people interviewed here today said Russia didn't need the food aid that makes up half of Mr. Clinton's package. Scenes like this at one of Moscow's charity canteens are simply humiliating for most Russians who remember the days when the Soviet Union itself gave aid to the Third World. As for the new loans to buy American grain, Mr. Yeltsin's opponents will argue that this is of more help to American farmers than to Russia, which already has an unbearable foreign debt. With stock exchanges getting into gear in Russia, Mr. Clinton has targeted the privatization program for direct aid. But many Russians will regard this as pouring cash into the pockets of people they regard as get-rich-quick merchants.
Most ordinary Russians will not see the fruits of this aid package directly, but President Clinton's strong support for Mr. Yeltsin personally may make some of them think twice about voting against him in the referendum. Few people here want to return to the days when Russian leaders were shunned by the West. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, Moscow.
Well, our Moscow correspondent Ben Brown has been in Vancouver for the summit. Ben, he may be a man who can deal with America, but how much, if at all, will the summit have strengthened his political position in the run-up to the referendum?
Michael, I don't think it's going to make very short-term difference, certainly not to the referendum this month. Clearly it's comforting for Mr. Yeltsin to have this extremely strong support from Bill Clinton. But it's not going to make very much difference, I don't think. And many Russians do feel humiliated that their leader should be asking for and accepting foreign aid. And I think Mr. Yeltsin's opponents at home are going to use that against him and claim that he's a puppet, even a plaything of the West.
£1 billion sounds a lot, but how much difference is it going to make to Russia's ramshackle economy?
It does sound a lot, but it actually amounts to about $10 per head of the Russian population, and it's a fairly minuscule amount compared to the monumental problems that the Russian economy is facing. So I don't think, again, this is going to make much difference to the outcome of the referendum, because ordinary Russians are affected by problems that won't be dealt with by this aid. They're facing 2,000% inflation, which is wiping out their savings. They're finding it very hard to survive on a fixed income. And so the way they vote in the referendum, I don't think will be changed by this aid. This aid is going to take quite a long time to filter through. But on the other hand, Mr. Yeltsin can look forward to more aid coming, many billions of dollars worth, when the G7 leaders, the G7 foreign and finance ministers meet in a couple of weeks' time. They're going to be discussing substantial aid, many billions of dollars worth, much more than Mr. Clinton has given.
Ben Brown in Vancouver, thanks very much. Here, the Jockey Club, horse racing's governing body, is to hold a full inquiry into what went wrong at the Grand National on Saturday. It's also decided to introduce some measures immediately to prevent the same thing happening again. The race was declared void after 2 false starts.
Unaccustomed to the glare of unwelcome publicity, the men who run a sport that's now a multi-million-pound industry arrived at the Jockey Club's London headquarters today to review the shambles that have been Saturday's Grand National. The result of the biggest stewards' inquiry the sport has known, an examination of what went wrong, a working party to study different ways of starting and stopping races, and an immediate change to procedures, as yet unrevealed, to take place from tomorrow. Also, an apology.
The stewards wish to express their profound regret generally to all supporters of racing, and particularly to the racegoers at Aintree and the connections and riders of the horses taking part, that this great national event was the cause of so much disappointment and frustration.
Now get their heads back, I can't get the tape up.
They might, though, have seen it coming. The same starter as at Aintree, Captain Keith Brown, had encountered similar problems at Cheltenham a year ago.
Right, come on! No, full start, full start, full start!
Then, though the flagman was clearly visible to the leaders, the field surged on with potentially fatal consequences. And even since then, the jockeys have encountered other incidents that could have foretold what happened at Aintree.
The authorities have to have a look at themselves in the fact that there's been several warnings of instances. We've had void races. I've witnessed one and ridden in another this season.
The methods for starting big steeplechases are clearly rudimentary and unchanged for decades. Stretched elastic is used on some courses, but that wouldn't work on a course as wide as Aintree. Flashing lights and klaxons have been experimented with and rejected as recall methods, as they'd frighten the horses. So what's the answer?
Good communications between starter and recall man. Recall men known to the jockeys, so that we have no worry about infiltrators or imposters, and the system will work.
Meanwhile, the bookmakers have been handing back the estimated £60 million they took in bets, but the real cost is to racing's credibility. Never mind mending fences, the sport demands that new infallible starting procedures must be devised.
The government has issued health authorities with new guidelines on AIDS. They say the authority must notify any patient who may have been put at risk by a health worker carrying the HIV virus. But there are no plans for compulsory testing of NHS staff.
Concern about possible HIV transmission from healthcare workers to patients was spurred by recent cases in which hospital staff died of AIDS or were found to be HIV positive. Thousands of ex-patients had to be contacted and counselled. Under the new guidelines, health authorities must tell patients if they've been at risk and offer them HIV tests. They must also ensure workers with the virus don't take part in certain surgical procedures and some dental and obstetric treatment.
I think our primary objective has been to reassure the public all along and to make sure that in revising these guidelines, and we will continue to revise them as evidence becomes available, but in revising these guidelines we have done everything to reassure the public.
The government's rejected compulsory testing of healthcare workers as impractical and ineffective. Workers are more at risk from patients than vice versa. 148 have been infected worldwide, whereas at most 5 patients have been infected, none in Britain. The new guidelines give workers who may be HIV positive an incentive to come forward voluntarily, because they now should be offered other work and guaranteed confidentiality.
They'll feel safe
that their names won't be all over the newspapers, that they'll be able to work elsewhere. They don't have to stop working. They'll be able to work in a different area of healthcare.
Some in the AIDS field are less happy with another Department of Health decision to cut the grant to the Terence Higgins Trust, the biggest AIDS charity, by 2/3 over the next 3 years. It'll fall from £450,000 to £150,000.
This decision by government is terribly short-sighted. It acts as a slap in the face to our 1,600 volunteers who give their time and effort to make the quality of life of people with AIDS slightly better in the United Kingdom. We face losing an opportunity to continue to contain this epidemic.
The Department of Health says it's necessary to shift resources and the Trust still gets the biggest grant. AIDS workers will hope the government's totally committed to fighting AIDS as well as reassuring the public about healthcare workers.
The skipper of a French trawler has appeared in court in Guernsey accused of fishing illegally. Michel Ménage was arrested on Friday by officers from a Royal Navy protection vessel in the dispute between Britain and France over fishing rights. In Cherbourg, fishermen from both countries appealed to their governments to settle the dispute.
This afternoon, the dispute moved from the seas to the courts. Michel Ménage, the skipper of the Calypso held since Friday, arrived to face 2 charges: fishing illegally in British waters and failing to comply with an order from a fisheries protection officer. 14 witnesses will be called, 11 from the Navy. As they started to give evidence, navigational charts were brought in. Each of the officers were asked to pinpoint exactly where Calypso had been sailing. Officers from HMS Brocklesby told the court the Calypso was spotted fishing west of Guernsey. The bearings taken showed it was inside British limits. The boat was boarded and ordered to St. Peter Port. Instead, Monsieur Ménage sailed to Cherbourg, ignoring repeated requests to turn back. As the case was adjourned, the Calypso itself remained lashed up in the harbour, impounded. It has all enraged fishermen in Cherbourg, and into that, overnight, sailed the first Guernsey trawlers for over a week. 12 slipped into the harbour, one by one, their cargo of shellfish unloaded without incident. The Easter market is a vital one for Guernsey fishermen. More trawlers will now follow. Then, as some left for home, they were suddenly called back. French fishermen wanted to thrash out the problems face to face, and after much talking, a joint declaration.
The Science Fishermen's organisations urge the French and the British governments to urgently sort out the problem in accordance with the wishes of the fishermen.
But there's been talk of peace many times before in this dispute. In Guernsey, they know it hasn't happened so far. If the skipper of the Calypso is found guilty here, he could be fined up to £51,000. Fishermen in Normandy have already said they'll club together to pay any penalty. They've also made it plain that if Monsieur Ménage is harshly treated, then they will respond.
The chief executive of Mirror Group newspapers, David Montgomery, has said the company lost more than £80 billion last year, but he insisted it had a bright future. He denied suggestions that he planned to end the Daily Mirror's traditional support for the Labour Party.
Today's figures are another dose of bad news from the Daily Mirror. Its plunge into loss was caused by one-off redundancy and reorganisation costs of over £100 million. The group's been plagued by problems since the death 18 months ago of its former owner, Robert Maxwell. But David Montgomery, the man who's moved over from Rupert Murdoch's media empire to run the group, says the Mirror has a bright future. He denies his strategy includes a shift to the right in the paper's editorial stance.
The paper's support for the left of centre and its tradition of backing the Labour Party is undiminished. Our detractors, usually in competing organisations, would like the world to think that this might be the case, but that tradition is defended very aggressively.
Mr. Montgomery's tough style of management has come under fire from unions and Labour politicians. Senior journalists and one director have left noisily, and Labour are worried that if the Mirror deserted them, they would lose their only voice in the tabloid press.
At the moment we have very unfair, very unbalanced media coverage of politics in this country. There are very few newspapers that give the Labour Party any fair coverage at all. And for the Mirror to desert the Labour Party too would be dreadful.
The Mirror is seen as the last bastion of the old Fleet Street labour practices that other papers have left behind as they move to new premises. The Mirror too might soon be leaving its landmark headquarters at Holborn Circus.
New laws to force absent parents to pay maintenance for their children came into effect today. The new Child Support Agency will have the power to trace parents, usually fathers, to assess how much maintenance they should pay and to take the money direct from their pay packets. There are over 1 million single-parent families in this country. Only a third of those single parents receive any maintenance, and their benefits bill costs the government £4.3 billion a year. In the first year of the Child Support Agency, the government hopes to save more than £500 million.
The number of children in one-parent families has doubled in the past 10 years, placing an ever-increasing benefits burden on the state. Since her divorce 5 years ago, Lynn Davies has got no maintenance and relies on income support to bring up her daughter Jenny. Now the Child Support Agency will be able to track down her ex-husband and make him pay.
I see it as a moral issue. I don't think that absent parents should be able to just walk away from their children and not pay a penny towards their upkeep.
Single-parent organisations welcome the principle that absent fathers should pay. But because maintenance will replace benefits pound for pound, some parents on income support could be worse off.
Some women and some men will be floated off income support, so they'll lose things like free school meals for their children and free prescriptions and other health benefits, and that will mean that some of the poorest people already living at the margins will be pushed further down.
The 5 largest children's charities agree, saying the new system will mean a greater risk of poverty for many children. They're concerned too that women who refuse to name absent fathers can be fined 20% of their benefits for 6 months. The Child Support Agency says mothers fearing violence won't have to name ex-partners, but it accepts there's no immediate financial incentive for many women on benefits to cooperate.
If maintenance is established now, over time when their circumstances change, for example when they go back to work, this will be a very tangible benefit of portable income.
For thousands of fathers already paying maintenance, it means higher bills as settlements are gradually reassessed. David Ellison reckons support for his 2 children will increase so much he'll be left with no disposable income.
If the government bring me down to income support level, then obviously I'm not getting anything out of working anymore, so I'd have to give me job. And that is a real possibility.
Through its computer network, the Child Support Agency will be able to trace most absent fathers, and this should lead to a dramatic increase in the numbers paying maintenance. Settlements will be higher too, averaging £50 a week, twice that of existing court awards. Eventually, the agency hopes that, like death and taxes, child maintenance will be seen as unavoidable and the inevitable consequence of parenthood.
Football and 3 goals in the first 21 minutes put Manchester United well in command of tonight's FA Premier League game at Norwich. With about 10 minutes left, they're leading by 3-1. If United win, they'll overtake Norwich in the table and move into second place behind Aston Villa. And tonight's main news again. The UN is planning to evacuate 15,000 Muslims from the besieged town of Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia. There's more on Newsnight at 10:30 on BBC 2. But from the 9 o'clock news, good night.
Good evening from Newsroom South East. Almost a year after the bombing of London's Baltic Exchange, in which 3 people were killed, traders have kept their promise to resume business there. The IRA's biggest mainland bomb injured a further 91 people the day after the Conservatives' election victory.
Hundreds of brokers returned to the Baltic Exchange today as business reopened here for the first time in nearly a year. The bomb on April the 10th was one of the largest since the war. It killed 3 people, injured 91 and did £800 million worth of damage. But there's been little loss to business.
I would say that we probably have increased our business in London since the bomb. The markets have improved, which always means there is an increase in business. But there's been a lot of sympathy and understanding from the rest of the world.
But the original trading floor is still unrestored, like much of the other damage in the area. It'll be at least 2 years before it's back in business.
A 9-year-old boy has been killed and another seriously injured in a freak skiing accident. The boys from Carterton in Oxfordshire fell 40 feet to the ground when their chairlift collided with another at a ski resort in California. Michael Roper was killed instantly. He was on holiday with 14-year-old Philip Giles, who was seriously injured in the accident. Philip's father and Michael's mother Karen watched helplessly from their own chairlifts. The electricity company SEEBoard, which supplies Kent, Surrey and South East London, is to cut up to 600 jobs. Around 500 jobs will go over the next 2 or 3 years as a result of a major efficiency drive. Most will be lost through natural wastage and voluntary redundancy. 100 jobs will be axed when the head office at Hove in Sussex moves to Crawley. And that's it for now. Join us tomorrow morning in breakfast time. But now let's look at the weather with Ian McCaskill.
Hello, it's been a very wet and a very showery day. 25 millimetres or an inch of rain in many places. You can see the reason why on the satellite sequence. This corkscrew, this curl of cloud, clearly marks the centre of a deep, deep low pressure area, which is just at this moment trundling along the M8 between the Forth and the Clyde valleys there, out into the North Sea during tomorrow. But already the next frontal system gathering its strength out here to spread yet another band, another massive cloud and rain northeastwards across the country during Wednesday and Thursday. But with winds coming from the southwest, it's never going to be particularly cold. Having said that, there could well be a ground frost in many places on Wednesday morning. No frost tonight. Lots of showers showing up on the radar anywhere from North Wales northwards. There's still some pretty heavy ones in places, and there'll be some showers coming through in the south as well. They won't miss all the showers, and it's a pretty windy night too. Winds still actually picking up over many parts of England and Wales, gusts to gale force in many parts through a frost-free night. And then tomorrow, cloudy in the north and east with rain or showers at times. Another windy day, by the way. Brighter though tomorrow in the south and the west. More broken cloud, a lot of cloud certainly, more broken cloud, lots of cloud, a little sunshine, 1 or 2 showers, fewer showers down in the south and the west than there have been today. Those showers dying away too in many places as we go through the day, becoming brighter in the far northeast, eventually drying up in Shetland as well. But by evening, some more rain could be getting into the far southwest of England and perhaps the Channel Islands as well. Those are quite big hours, gusting into gale force once again as the low moves away across the North Sea. Those are the average winds at lunchtime tomorrow. Strong enough in all conscience, 30 miles an hour, gusts could well be 40, 45 miles an hour. Doesn't look too bad, the numbers, 10 in the north, 13 in the south, but with that wind it's going to feel cool everywhere. And then on Wednesday, ground frost at first, but clouds and rain gradually spreading northwards and eastwards during the course of Wednesday and Thursday.
They're excited about it.